Welcome, everyone. Today's story tells of America's Independence Day. I hope you all enjoy, and please remember to like and subscribe, or we will revert back to the Dark Ages. The oppressive Philadelphia summer of 1776 hung heavy in the air, a thick, humid blanket that clung to the skin and stifled the breath. Inside the Pennsylvania State House, later to be known as Independence Hall, the heat was amplified by the press of bodies, the nervous energy, and the monumental weight of the decisions at hand. For weeks, the Second Continental Congress had debated, argued, and wrestled with the idea that had once been unthinkable, then whispered, and now shouted from pulpits and pamphlets across the colonies: independence from Great Britain. The delegates, men of diverse backgrounds and temperaments, lawyers, merchants, planters, doctors, represented the 13 fractious colonies, united only by a common grievance and a burgeoning sense of a shared destiny. John Hancock, portly and resplendent in his crimson waistcoat, presided with a theatrical flair that belied the immense anxiety gnawing at him. He knew, as did every man in that sweltering chamber, that their deliberations were not merely political. They were a collective act of treason, punishable by the hangman's noose. The initial call for independence had come from Richard Henry Lee of Virginia on June 7th, resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to, be, totally dissolved. This resolution had ignited weeks of fierce debate. Voices of caution, led by Pennsylvania's John Dickinson, argued for reconciliation, fearing a ruinous war and questioning the colony's ability to stand alone. He spoke of the inherent dangers, the raw vulnerability of a nascent nation daring to defy the mightiest empire on earth. Others, particularly those from the middle colonies, wavered, their loyalties torn between long-held traditions and the compelling logic of freedom. But the tide was turning. The bloodshed at Lexington and Concord, the burning of Norfolk, the British hiring of Hessian mercenaries, these acts had hardened hearts and steeled resolves. Thomas Paine's fiery pamphlet, Common Sense, had ripped through the intellectual landscape, laying bare the absurdity of a continent being governed by an island. The people, driven by a volatile mix of principled defiance and pragmatic self-interest, were increasingly ready. Leading the charge for independence was the indefatigable John Adams of Massachusetts, a man of sharp intellect and often sharper tongue. Despite his unpopularity in some quarters, his passion was undeniable. He spoke with the conviction of a prophet, arguing that the time for hesitation was past, that the destiny of America lay in its own hands. His voice, though not the most mellifluous, cut through the humid air of the State House, urging, cajoling, demanding. Beside him, Benjamin Franklin, the venerable sage of Pennsylvania, offered his wisdom with typical wit and an air of calm that belied the gravity of their mission. He understood the stakes better than most, having spent years negotiating in London. He knew reconciliation was a mirage. On July 1st, the debate resumed. The air was thick with tension. Vote after vote failed to achieve unanimity. The New York delegation was still awaiting instructions. South Carolina and Pennsylvania were divided. Delaware was tied. It seemed the bold march toward freedom might falter at the precipice. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, a young but influential delegate, rose and proposed an adjournment until the next day, hoping that time, and perhaps some backroom persuasion, might sway the hesitant. The motion passed. That evening, Adams, Franklin, and others worked tirelessly, pleading with wavering delegates. Caesar Rodney of Delaware, ill and exhausted, rode 80 miles through a thunderstorm, arriving in the State House just in time on July 2nd to cast the deciding vote for independence for his colony, breaking the tie. When the vote was finally called on July 2nd, the assent was remarkable. 12 colonies voted in favor. New York abstained, unable to vote until July 9th, when their convention officially adopted the resolution. The Lee Resolution passed. The United Colonies had declared themselves free and independent. John Adams, writing to his wife, Abigail, that evening, believed July 2nd would be the most memorable epocha in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shoes, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. He was off by 2 days on the exact date of celebration, but his foresight was prescient. With independence declared, the focus shifted to the formal declaration. A committee had been appointed weeks earlier to draft a document explaining the reasons for their bold step. The task had fallen primarily to Thomas Jefferson, a Virginian of quiet demeanor but profound intellect and a graceful literary hand. For 17 days, working in rented rooms on Market Street, tormented by a persistent headache and the flies of summer, Jefferson had labored over the draft. Informed by Enlightenment philosophy, particularly the ideas of John Locke, and drawing upon existing proclamations of colonial rights, he had crafted a masterpiece of political prose. His initial draft had been presented to Congress on June 28th. Over the next few days, it was subjected to intense scrutiny and debate. Congress made numerous alterations, striking out Jefferson's strong condemnation of the slave trade, a concession to Southern delegates, fearful of losing crucial support, and softening some of the language criticizing the British people. Jefferson, a fastidious writer, winced at every change, but understood the necessity of compromise for unanimity. On July 5th, the revised Declaration of Independence was brought before Congress for a final vote. The air was still heavy, but now with a different kind of tension, one of anticipation rather than indecision. After a few more minor tweaks, the document was adopted. It was not a grand public ceremony, as imagination often portrays, but a solemn, almost understated act. John Hancock, as president, was the first to sign the engrossed copy, his signature famously large and bold, so that His Majesty may read without spectacles. Charles Thomson, the Secretary of Congress, also affixed his signature to the official broadside that would be printed that night. The immediate aftermath was not marked by widespread public celebration on July 4th itself. The news traveled at the speed of horse and sail. However, the first public reading occurred 4 days later, on July 8th, in the State House yard in Philadelphia. Colonel John Nixon, a member of the Committee of Safety, stood on the wooden platform erected for the occasion. A large crowd had gathered, eager to hear the words that had been adopted. As Nixon's clear voice rang out, proclaiming that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states, a wave of profound emotion swept through the assembly. Cheers erupted. Hats were thrown into the air. The Liberty Bell, housed in the State House steeple, rang out in joyous peals, its bronze voice proclaiming liberty throughout the land. Accounts from the day tell of spontaneous celebrations, bonfires lit, effigies of King George III pulled down and burned, and celebratory cannon fire echoing across the city. The taverns, unsurprisingly, were full. From Philadelphia, copies of the Declaration, printed by John Dunlap, were dispatched by couriers to every colony. To General George Washington and his beleaguered Continental Army, then stationed in New York, and to foreign powers. When the Declaration arrived in New York, Washington ordered it read to his troops. For soldiers weary from months of fighting, the words were a powerful affirmation of their cause, transforming a rebellion into a fight for nationhood. They responded by pulling down the equestrian statue of King George III and melting it down into musket balls. Across the continent, as the news spread, similar scenes unfolded. In Boston, the Declaration was read from the balcony of the old State House, amidst ringing bells and loud huzzas. In Savannah, Georgia, it was read aloud by the local council, met with cheers and a 13-gun salute. The common people, those who often bore the brunt of British policies, now had a clear, articulated vision of their struggle. They were no longer fighting for a redress of grievances, but for a new world. Yet, amidst the jubilation, there was a profound understanding of the peril. The signing of the Declaration was not just a philosophical statement, it was an act of war and a personal commitment to the cause of freedom. As Benjamin Franklin famously quipped, "We must all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." Indeed, while the Declaration was adopted on July 4th, most of the delegates did not affix their signatures to the iconic parchment until August 2nd, when a carefully engrossed copy was finally ready. On that hot August day, one by one, 56 men approached the table, their names to be etched into history. It was a sober, terrifying moment. Each signature was a pledge of our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. The signers were not a homogeneous group. They represented the full spectrum of colonial society, from the wealthy merchant John Hancock to the self-made printer Benjamin Franklin, from the brilliant lawyer Thomas Jefferson to the fiery orator Samuel Adams. What united them was courage. They knew the price of failure could be immense: confiscation of property, imprisonment, or death. Many would pay dearly for their audacity. Thomas Hayward, Jr., Edward Rutledge, Arthur Middleton, and Thomas Lynch, Jr. of South Carolina were captured by the British during the war. Richard Stockton of New Jersey was imprisoned and tormented. Many had their homes burned or pillaged. The path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. The war would drag on for 7 more long years, often seeming hopeless. But the Declaration of Independence, born of fire and conviction in that stifling Philadelphia summer, had fundamentally altered the landscape. It was more than a document. It was a beacon, a moral compass, and a testament to the belief that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. The 4th of July, though originally a quiet adoption rather than a boisterous signing, grew into the celebrated national holiday John Adams had envisioned. It became a day to remember the profound courage of the men who, in the face of tyranny, dared to declare a new nation, founded on the revolutionary ideals of liberty and self-governance. It was, and remains, a true story of audacious hope, born in the heart of a sweltering city, echoing through the ages. Thank you for listening, and please remember to like and subscribe. The Dark Ages sound cool until you're struck with the dancing plague. Okay, maybe that isn't so bad.